Ingrid Swenson. I'm the director of Peer. And for those of you who are based in London, though I understand we've got people joining us from around the globe, which is amazing, but those are lucky enough to be in London. If you haven't had a chance yet to see the exhibition called Swirl of Words, Swirl of Worlds, I'd very much urge you to try and visit the gallery on Hoxton Street and Shoreditch Library across the road, where we're presenting a group exhibition of the same name, which includes a number of works in a lot of different media, painting, film, and I hope you find it very engaging. There is much more information about the exhibition on the website. And so the book, the Swirl of Words, Swirl of Worlds book, with the subtitle Poems from 94 Languages Spoken Across Hackney, it's the book, the exhibition, as well as a very ambitious program of events, readings and workshops. And so all of these events and workshops will be carrying on till the 14th of August. So if you are interested in knowing more about what we're doing and you can't make it, a lot of these events either will be, you can join virtually, such as this one, or we are doing a lot of recordings and filming of the events, and they'll be posted on the website as the project progresses. We had a wonderful celebration on Saturday, the 5th of June, when 12 poets and translators came to Peer and came and did readings outside the front of Peer. Two of the poets and translators are here today. Kristina Kuneva read her poem, and Caoimhin Magolile read the poem, which she'll be reading this evening as well, along with a Scottish Gaelic poem. So we've had a little taste of what we're going to hear tonight, which is really fantastic. So I'm very pleased to see that Gareth now joined us. Thank you, Gareth. And I'll introduce him now. He'll be moderating this evening. Gareth Evans is the Whitechapel Gallery's adjunct moving image curator. And amongst many other strings to his bow, he's recently working on the Estuary Festival, and he's been extremely active during this last sort of year and a half pandemic time. So he'll be introducing all of the poets and translators, and will be guiding them through as they read material from the book, and be talking with him about some of the broader themes and issues from the book. So if you're ready for me to hand over, Gareth, thank you very much. And yes, we can have questions later on, but thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ingrid. Apologies for my delay in arriving. If I was, of course, in a famous British 70s sitcom, I would say 11 minutes late, of course, leaves on the line at Clapham Junction. Some of you will know what that refers to, others won't. And therein, of course, lies the issue of translation. What does cross cultural borders? What doesn't? Poetry absolutely does, of course, which is why we're here to celebrate this outstanding collection, initiative, exhibition, project, and much else besides, with obviously a quartet of its wonderful contributors and the mothership that is Stephen Watts, of course, at its heart. Now, we're going to take you through the next hour or so with our wonderful contributors coming in. They're all visible to you now. This is a slight change in plan from what we had in mind. And the last thing I want to do is tell them to go back into the void that is Zoom, of course. But I will be bringing people in conversationally in a kind of creative baton relay over the next hour or so that obviously we can give them their moment in the Zoom light, in the glory of the technology. And obviously focus on the language in question each time. But wonderful to have all of them with us, and I will obviously welcome and introduce them as we do so. Many thanks to everyone at Peer Gallery, of course, for making this possible, particularly tonight, Ingrid, Isabel, and Rosa. And of course, to all of you for being here, please do contribute. This is the whole point of this project. Of course, it's a massively contributory project in all sorts of ways, from the conception through the production and the circulation of the publication onwards. But of course, it's a dialogue that has been opened up by Stephen and all his collaborators. And it's about exchange in the very basic and fundamental and necessary sense of the word. So please do take that chance. And I will be keeping an eye on the chat column and feeding in questions, of course, for each of our contributors as they come in, but also for Stephen throughout wherever necessary. So let's really hope that we can get a conversation going in this part of the event programme, which runs, of course, alongside the exhibition in Shoreditch Library and in the Peer Gallery until the middle of August. Do remember, if you haven't already done so, that you can pick up a copy of the book from any Hackney library, and you don't have to formally be a citizen or resident of Hackney. You can go in and join the library, receive a copy of the book, and what a wonderful thing it is. Now, Stephen, amazing that you have taken this project through from idea to publication, and you have been obviously helped and have, as you always have done, thanked many, many people in the publication and live in person outside Peer for enabling you to do this. But this is not something that comes out of the blue for you. This is absolutely central to who you are as a person, as a poet, as a translator, as an advocate, and have been for over 40 years. And it runs, importantly, alongside this extraordinary project that you have made, which is a bibliography of poetry into English over the 20th century, which maybe you can talk about at a suitable moment whenever you feel best, which will also have its own exhibition incarnation in London in the near future. But when did the idea for this particular project come to mind, to the shared collective mind of yourself and your collaborators? And then how did you see the best way to take it forward?
Well, thanks, Gareth. Peer approached me in summer of 2019, so that's already 2 years ago, when they were planning an exhibition that the present exhibition bears some resemblance to, but has also changed. And we worked on a number of projects. The exhibition was originally due to take place in the summer of 2020. It, of course, had to be postponed, and postponed a number of times in not particularly foreseeable ways. When lockdown began at the end of March 2020, we talked about the possible ways of presenting the exhibition, making it accessible in ways that would get round what had been shut off. And one of us, I honestly don't know who, said, why don't we work on a collection of poetry of the languages that are spoken in Hackney? And I thought that was a superb idea. Quite a foolish idea, but like many foolish ideas, the best. How on earth to do it? But we managed to do it within 12 months. It wouldn't have actually happened without lockdown. That's a strange thing to realize, because if lockdown hadn't happened, we wouldn't have had to renegotiate the way of showing the exhibition. The exhibition has a number of strands to do with language, to do with memory, to do with the sort of inner landscape of language and memory within us as individuals and within us as communities. And this was going to be shown by a number of films, a number of workshops, a number of readings. When lockdown came, we suddenly thought we could actually try and produce a book. And that is what we did.
No, tremendous. You certainly did. And what a book it is. And just to stress, of course, that the book exists thanks to the crowdfunder that was set in motion by Peer, of course, where many wonderful people supported that, receiving a hardback edition of the book as thanks for their efforts and their endeavour. And enabling 3,000 copies, of course, of the paperback to be circulated in the way I just described earlier. So truly a gift in the best and most profound way of the gift economy. Now, you know, you mentioned this idea idea, of course, of sourcing the languages of Hackney. Now, this is, of course, partly based on the census, which happened, in the last stages of the recent lockdown in March 2021. So we're reminded again, of course, of the changing population dynamics of the city 10 years on, perhaps, from when the first language listing was sourced. But of course, as you say in your introduction, Hackney is where Peer is situated. It makes complete sense. It's a city in its own terms, almost of 250,000 plus people. And it's a city, very much a borough, a district of the world, but it speaks to the larger London. It speaks to any city that is engaged with the processes of the contemporary moment, which hosts populations from all over the world. So what is your sense of that relationship between the Hackney identity of the book and the larger possibility of the book belonging to any community, really?
Yes, I mean, this book is about Hackney because Peer as a gallery is in Hackney and has a tremendous community sense and sensibility. But a similar book could have been made for any borough in London, for almost any city in Britain, any city in Europe, any city in the world. I mean, that is one of the characteristics of all contemporary cities, that they are utterly multilingual. Even when there is a dominant language or a most widely spoken language or a lingua franca, there are always very, very many other languages. I mean, I remember back in the 1990s, it was common currency to talk about over 300 languages being spoken in London at that time. Clearly, it was actually more than 300, but that was what was said. So it's something that, whilst based in Hackney, has resonance everywhere and anywhere.
Now, we're going to hear a number of poems, of course, through the course of this event, and we're going to hear 4 from you that you've been directly involved in bringing, of course, to the book. And I wonder, Stephen, perhaps if we could hear the first of those from you now.
I'll read a poem by the Kurdish Syrian poet Golan Haji, who lives in Paris at the moment. I'm just reading the translation. We translated it together in Paris, and it's called Crescent. Obviously it reflects his exile, among other things. You thinned your pain. As a boy on the frontier, you placed it like a small coin under the wheels of a train, and a girl you loved made herself a necklace from it in the fields. Smugglers taught you how to strike it in the quiet of the night with the hammers of thieves, to conceal your finger marks in front of others. You thinned it with silence, with long walks, until it became transparent and hard, like a cut nail disappeared in the carpet of time. And when you found it, it had become a moon eaten away by love, and you hung it in the sky of your soul. And you stayed awake all alone, waiting for the Atzan of Eid. Now, for me, that's a very beautiful poem, but also a poem about the pain of memory, about returning to childhood, about the poet not able to return to the place of his childhood.
Yes, indeed, it's a beautiful poem, and you've translated a collection of Golan's poetry, which has been published, of course, and widely acclaimed. Now, Stephen, we could spend, many Zoom conversations with yourself and with our wonderful guests talking about how translation works, what it is, where the weight and emphasis of the carrying across, quite literally, the Latin meaning of the word lies between the original language and the new language, and so on. But if there is a kind of core principle in how you approach translation, I wonder if you could share that with us now.
I think there have to be many, many different types of translation, as many as there are translators, because every translation is, in a sense, rooted in the individual who wrote the text originally and the individual or individuals translating it. But having said that, for me, an essence of co-translation, because I work with other poets and other translators, an essence of it is really the word friendship and the possibility of sitting together and enabling a translation to come out of that process of sitting at a table and exchanging words and exchanging understanding. Now, that won't be true for every translator at all, and there have to be very, very many different methodologies, different practices. But for me, that access of friendship between one poet and another poet is what is essential.
And of course, that friendship, is both one that's extant. Both poets are alive and know each other well in a literal sense, as well as, of course, within the lines and pages of the work. But of course, it can exist across time and space, where the translator is in creative dialogue with someone no longer with us. And so friendship takes on a much larger palette, if you like, already in your description of it. It's a form of connection to other people that collapses time and space. And I guess that's perhaps also for you what a poem does. When it's working at its best, poetry makes a new kind of present, regardless of the historical origin of the work. Would that be a good way to think about it?
Yeah, I think the term friendship is an extremely wide term, as you say, and I utterly feel that a poem and a translation breathe in the same place, in the same atmosphere. They are very, very similar acts, writing a poem and writing a translation. And personally, I really would want to emphasize that very strongly. And I agree entirely with what you just said.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Stephen. Well, let's welcome our first guest now. If we could welcome Kristina. Kristina, do please make yourself known to us. That would be tremendous. Now, you're a Bulgarian. Kristina, welcome to you.
Hi everyone.
Really great to have you with us. Now, you're Bulgarian, you're a poet, you're living in London, and you have provided a translation of your own poem, very helpfully for our purposes tonight, called London, which seemed to be a great way to start. Now, I think perhaps before we have a word with you about that, I wonder if you could share that with us, and it'd be great if you could share it with us in both languages, please.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
I'll start with the Bulgarian version. Just the short sentence before I start with it. Few moments before I joined the meeting, I stumbled upon an article regarding research showing that the language we speak impacts our personalities. So that really speaks to me, and it's really important for me that I can join tonight reading in both my language and English, so I can really be fully present in this event. So thank you for this opportunity. There we go. We start with the Bulgarian version. Лондон, където нощем Дилан Томас хапе пръстците на белите си музи. Денем карантиненото небе е кипи от живот. Гарвани и гларуси летят в отрицателното море, не морето нагоре от хоризонта. Лондон, където кротко пуска музика за слона в стаята. Той никога не забравя. Затова му подбирам най-деликатните звуци. Един стъклен тайк с червен ореол с вода около челото, побран в апартамент на Бърдет Роуд, твърде голяма, за да може да скочи от прозореца. И все пак има някаква велика синхроничност в това. Бавно кървя, орхидеята бавно цъфти, ям филия с лютеница и очаквам луната в рамката на прозореца и дано да не видя самолет. Във време на световна карантина бих умряла от любопитство да разбера къде отиват пътниците му. Наистина ли животът продължава? Непоносимата шега на битието. Ние имаме срок на годност по-кратък от въпросите. Thank you. And the version in English. London, where at night Dylan Thomas bites the white calves of his muses. During the day the quarantine sky is boiling with life. Crows and gulls fly in the negative sea, in the non-sea risen up from the horizon. London, where I gently play music for the elephant in the room. She never forgets. This is why I chose the most delicate sounds for her. A glass tyke with a red halo of freedom around the forehead, barely fitted in an apartment on Burgett Road, too big to jump out the window. And yet, there is some great synchronicity in that. I bleed slowly, the orchid slowly blooms. Eating peppers on toast, I wait for the moon in the window frame, and I hope I don't see an airplane. At the time of global quarantine, I would die out of curiosity to find out where its passengers go. Does life really go on? The unbearable joke of being. We have a shelf life shorter than the questions.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Now that's a tremendous last line to allow us to think, if you like, a little bit about this relationship between literature and life. We have a shelf life shorter than the questions that life suggests to us. It's a great way to think about what literature can do for us, to think about these huge questions, particularly at a time like the one in which we find ourselves in, where there are many, many challenges. Now, you're Bulgarian in a kind of horrible hierarchy of world languages. Bulgarian is seen as a kind of minority language. If you're experiencing literature from the world, of course, the majority of it will have to be translated into Bulgarian for you as a first language speaker. But in the other way, of course, Bulgarian literature needs to reach us. Otherwise we, of course, are reduced in our experience of the world. What is your sense generally of that relationship between Bulgarian and English? I mean, it's not by any means a balanced one, of course, you know, in numerical terms. But do you feel that Bulgarian writers, both now and historically, have even a chance to be heard properly? And if so, where do you think those kind of key areas of support are?
Well, yes, certainly there's a lot of literature who has reached other countries from Bulgaria. In fact, your question makes me think of my first job in London. It was in the British Library, well, in the cafe, but still in the British Library. And I was very happy when one of the customers told me that he just saw a Bulgarian original in one of the exhibitions. So yes, certainly, as in any other country, really, nowadays we have plenty of ways to communicate with others. So yes, there are many contemporary and classical writers, poets who have been translated and still are to English and vice versa. Well, also, as I said, there's a lot of information out there, so it probably also comes to how interested the world is in them, I guess, and how well they promote themselves, which I think is something that we slightly lack. I guess writers still live into the idea of craftsmanship in Bulgaria a little more than here in London, which means that, well, I've worked with artists, for example, and many of them in Bulgaria, again, I guess they're pretty much the same as writers. They'll just stick to being hands-on on their work, but would have no clue how to promote themselves. And yeah, I guess that's a totally different thing. You don't have to be good with online positioning if you want to write, but you definitely have to do it if you want to be heard, especially in other countries, I guess, or find people to do it. So I'm not sure if I correctly understood your question, but Long story short, yes, there is Bulgarian literature being translated. Not many of it, I guess, is heard in London, unfortunately.
Well, it's a small start now, of course, and a very welcome one with your poem being in this collection. Now, Stephen, of course, please do come in whenever you want to throughout the event with your own much more informed questions than mine. But just one more, Kristina, I guess thinking about the idea of being in London for you, the sense of a poetic, of a literary, of a Bulgarian community, perhaps. Do you feel part of an active landscape in London creatively and as a writer? And has that, shifted perhaps? Of course, it's changed for all of us in real life, as it were, over the last year. But do you think it's a healthy scene for you? Do you feel supported in what you want to do here in a literary sense?
Yes, I'm happy to admit that I haven't faced any. Well, people usually welcome me being Bulgarian and are usually curious about my culture. So I feel really privileged to be able to be part of London communities and be welcome for who I am.
Thank you very much. Well, one of your friends, of course, is Stephen, who has already spoken about how important friendship is to us. Now, Stephen, your sense of course, in your massive bibliographical project, which we'll keep mentioning, I think, throughout the event, Bulgarian, of course, is part of that. And what is your sense, really, in terms of what Kristina's been talking about how we have a sense, if we do, and I hope we do, of what Bulgarian literature should mean to us?
Yeah, I think Kristina has really said very accurately. There's a lot of very strong, wonderful Bulgarian writing, a little bit of which has been translated into English, or some of which has been. How widely read is another matter, because something can be translated, a superb text can be translated, but actually not make it through to many readers at all, and that's always a problem. I was very glad that Kristina just said that she feels happy and feels she has a place in London as a Bulgarian poet. I think that's a very positive thing, and it's a beautiful thing to hear her say. There is more poetry, more fiction being translated now. That there are initiatives, by the Elizabeth Kostova Society in North America. Kristina herself organizes sort of festivals connected with Bulgarian writing in London, and those things are really vital. But there's a long way to go still, I think.
As ever, it's a constant process, isn't it? And we must be grateful for initiatives like this, of course, that really help us to focus those energies. But it's certainly a long-term journey. And Kristina, this applies to you, of course, and to all our other wonderful guests. Please do post during the course of the event any links that you want the audience to see in the Q&A strand, if you could, of the Zoom window. So any links to your own activities or poetry of your own and others you'd like us to know about. If you put that into the Q&A box, not into the chat box, that's a different one, but into the Q&A one, that would be great. And at any point that's suitable to you. But I think if that's okay with you now, thank you so much for being with us. Of course, you're not going to go anywhere, I hope. Just do maybe step back a little bit visually at this point, and we'll stay with us, of course, and we'll speak again, I hope. But thank you so much for that. Thank you very much indeed, Kristina. Now, that's tremendous to start us off. Really important, Stephen, I think, to keep in the mix, of course, from our Anglophone point of view, of course, that there are numerous languages with extraordinary literary histories. It goes without saying that, but, in our horribly unbalanced linguistic world, we need to remind ourselves of that all the time. That's what this project does. Absolutely. Now, I wonder if you could just think for us a little bit about how you feel poetry is central, even if, as you said yourself just now, of course, reading, numbers can go up and down in terms of the actual encounter with the writing. The making and the circulation of poetry is central to the health of any culture. And I know you feel that. You talk of it as being like breath. Could you just expand on that a little, even if people themselves, you know, are not familiar with poetry as writers or readers, to know that it's part of that culture is really crucial, I think. Yes.
Yeah, I think I feel two things there. I don't really feel that poetry is in the world. I feel that poetry is the world. And I feel that language, or rather I feel breath, which is essential to life, is essential to language, is essential to poetry. And there's a direct continuum between those three positions, if you want. So life, breath, language, poetry. For me, they're all utterly vital. And poetry is the world for me. Now, in terms of reading poetry, I know from experience that actually poetry at certain times in very, very many people's lives means a lot. On the other hand, yes, you can say that not much poetry means a lot to not many people at most times in their lives. But there is a way of turning that entirely on its pinion and saying that poetry does mean a great deal to a great number of people. I simply think that. I think that's true.
I completely agree with you, and thank you for putting it so well. Please, let's hear another poem of yours in translation from the collection, if we could. That would be great.
Okay, well, I'll read a poem by the Georgian poet Shota Iatashvili, who was born in 1966 and is still living in Tbilisi. And this is a poem set in the city of Tbilisi, in a park in that city, to a Veris park Café waiter. With your two hands stretched out, you brought us the cool melodies of summer, delicious smells, distinct visions. With your two hands stretched out, you fed us and you calmed us down. With your two hands stretched out, you told us everything is beautiful and vain. Your two hands stretched out are truthful and move over this small plot of earth, sadly but with purpose. Your two hands stretched out are the mark of equality between life and death. And I ask you to point your two stretched out hands upward and to show us who is there, the real sender of all this, to me and my friend at the two-seat table in Veris Park Café today, July the 30th, in the evening, 1998. So written in 1998, read in English in 2021.
Absolutely, it's a time-traveling operation, poetry, isn't it? Thank you so much. Very, very vivid there, and of course, already coding into the language, you know, and the subject matter, this idea of the internationalism of poetry, a kind of the benign globalization of our times, far more than other things that might attach to that terminology. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. I think it's great now. It feels like the right time to welcome Caoimhin. Caoimhin, are you there? It'd be lovely to hear from you now. Do please join us if you can. Thank you so much. Stephen, stay with us for a minute visually while we welcome Caoimhin. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, you're the Associate Professor in the School of Irish Celtic Studies and Folklore at University College Dublin, Caoimhin. Thank you so much for being with us. Now, you have a poem in the collection, and I think you have several more for us as well. So would you please like to lay out your stall now? That'd be great.
Well, I don't have a poem in the sense that while I did once write poetry a long, long time ago, it wasn't very good, but I have a translation
exactly
in the book, which is a translation of a short poem by Noèlia Diaz-Vicedo, who is the most celebrated poet writing in Irish currently. It's a short nature poem. In that sense, I suppose it harks back to some of the earliest poetry, the earliest literature in the Irish language almost a millennium and a half ago, which were these short nature lyrics written by the early Irish monks. Would you like me to read this?
Absolutely.
poem?
I think what we'll do, Stephen and I will disappear now, and if you'd like to read your, the full range of your contribution now, and then we can share that conversation with you. That would be great.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
This first poem, as I said, is a poem by Noèlia Diaz-Vicedo, which I'll read first in Irish and then my own translation. An chair a dúig. An chair a dúig. Olagón bog bín na crunne a casa a farsid. Siosca na gaiche gidianda os cian folús an divagáin. Dán mascalach an dain a faidir jaal a sailsú an bhainéad svéir. Titin breire na tangan dain de seo chun talamh ceann cheann ina néalta bána is uaine nos Cartini. And my English version. The Northern Lights. The Northern Lights, the soft, sweet lamentation of the world spinning on its axis, a whisper of a solar wind above the black abyss, the planet's strenuous poem, its shining prayer illuminating the magnetosphere. The words of this planetary tongue fall to earth one by one in clouds of white and green like a curtain fall. And the other poem I was asked to read, and I don't have any direct connection to this poem, by the great, by most people's accounts, the greatest Scottish Gaelic poet of the 20th century, whom I did know and heard reading many times, Swirl of Words, whose dates 1911 to 1996. This is a poem called Cynnismadda in Alley. Irish and Scottish Gaelic, of course, are historically connected. In fact, it was the same written literary language into the 17th century, but they are separate languages now, although with quite a lot of mutual intelligibility. This is the Scottish Gaelic. Cynnismadda in Alley. Har na shiriach harishnach, he mi mahan no yachte, she mi laragan on spo gebrech, gila huavnach and nach, kawak wood tanga follow. Gaid hulus madayan alach, a lame harmulachen and garuch, a rush for skal and groove and fasel, a gawal kuang and cool down, a shirif kashet and guv yawn, and wangan galanoch a shianel, her woman cruaye na naum kianel, and korstich vibuan na machloasen, in down riche gawal mavuagen. Reish na madurs na gun eargult, lua torach an yesh, tur na kailtin gun yeruch, har mullichin in bound gun heruch, kun huine kuhish ma varstuch, madian tauj na haljach, aljach an anamas an utin, fie gal har viaun is ruunchin, fie da voichit huun rulich, fiech gun skur. And the poet's own translation, Dogs and Wolves. Across eternity, across its snows, I see my unwritten poems. I see the spoor of their paws dappling the August whiteness of the snow. bristles raging, bloody-tongued, lean greyhounds and wolves leaping over the dikes, running under the shade of the trees of the wilderness, taking the narrow defile of glens, making for the steepness of windy mountains, their baying yells shrieking across the hard bareness of the terrible times, their everlasting barking in my ears, their hot onrush seizing my mind. Career of wolves and eerie dogs swift in pursuit of the quarry through the forests without veering, over the mountaintops without shearing, the mad, wild, mild, mad dogs of my poetry. Wolves in chase of loveliness, loveliness of soul and face, a white deer over hills and plains, the deer of your gentle, beloved beauty, a hunt without halt, without respite.
Caoimhin, tremendous. Thank you so much. A very vivid and evocative reading of two traditions, of course, within the Gaelic, and much to talk about there. I think the first question, which is a fairly obvious one, is that, you know, for you in Ireland, of course, there are two languages coexistent in the territory. We're not talking here about a, you know, a spatial translation, but a coexistence within territory. Now, of course, one predominates, and one can be also seen, the language we're all using today, as a kind of, you know, kind of colonial incursion into the territory as well, which comes with all sorts of baggage we probably haven't got time to go into here. But that idea of the coexistence, even if one perhaps feels slightly like the more vulnerable partner, is clearly crucially important to both languages, isn't it? I mean, they both are in constant dialogue as much with other parts of each respective language as they are with each other, of course. For you,
well, it is obvious. I mean, it's complicated by the fact that I guess Ireland has punched above its weight, so to speak, in literary terms, given the size of the country of the last 100 years. But of course, the big names in Irish literature in English, from Wilde and Shaw through Joyce and Yeats and on to Heaney and so forth, didn't all draw on the legacy of the Gaelic literature that had preceded English literature in Ireland, but many of them did. A complication that has to do with more recent times, I guess, is that for a poet like Noèlia Diaz-Vicedo, the poet whose work I just read, she hugely expanded her readership when she began publishing her poems in English, or when dual language anthologies were produced, which hadn't been so common for the generation of poets that preceded her in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So that in many ways, the visibility of poets writing in Irish became much greater from the 1980s on, which is basically my generation. So that Noèlia Diaz-Vicedo, there was a bilingual anthology called Pharaoh's Daughter, produced by Gallery Press, one of the great publishers of poetry in English in Ireland, and now also in dual language translations. That book of Noëlia's, selected poems of Noëlia's, came out in 1990, and in fact it had, as far as I can recall, 12 or 13 individual translators, almost all of whom were really well-known poets. So Seamus Heaney, Paul Muldoon, Michael Longley, so forth. So I often thought at the time, it was very well received. And of course, it, as I say, it expanded her reputation in North America and in the English language world. But I always thought it was a little like a relatively unknown recording artist producing this album with a dozen famous sort of singers, all duets, all of whose voices were familiar to almost everybody, but the person whose name was on the album wasn't. This was complicated by the fact that the translators, Heaney, Muldoon, and Maeve McGuckin and so forth, all had very different notions of the job of translation. Some were quite faithful, some were incredibly freewheeling, Maeve McGuckin, for instance, and Paul Muldoon. So the reception of a poet writing in Irish in a wider English-speaking world is quite complicated.
Absolutely. I mean, you've summarized it there brilliantly for us, and that's just with one poet in mind and one kind of collection that sort of takes us into that complex debate. I mean, within Gaelic itself, of course, we heard from Sorley MacLean in your wonderful reading, Scots Gaelic. And of course, Gaelic is a language, that has no single, geographical border. So are there tensions within the language itself? Of course, the different inflections of the territorial language. But can you identify a kind of, I mean, these are huge questions, which I'm sorry to impose on you at 5 to 7 on Friday, but can you identify a kind of quality in this, this larger Gaelic tradition that we might be advised to think about now or think through if we're going to approach these poets?
Well, I have colleagues who have slightly more essentialist tendencies than I do, so I tend to be a little agnostic. Given the huge variety in the output of even the small number of poets and indeed prose writers that have achieved prominence in the last 100 years or so, I mean, obviously the circumstances of writing in a minority language in a country which is effectively English speaking, one of the world's great languages, and those dynamics can't but have their impact on the output. The perception of this as being hugely problematic has kind of dogged prose writers a little bit more than poetry writers, because of course the tradition of the lyric is such that you imagine that you have this lone voice sort of speaking out in the wilderness, which seems to sort of work for readers, seems to be more credible somehow for a broader readership than the idea of writing a novel set in contemporary Dublin, which hasn't, or in any large city, a classic realist novel, in any large city when there hasn't been an Irish-speaking city and city life and so forth for centuries. So to be honest, we're getting a little bit away from poetry. So to some extent, the self-consciousness about writing in a minority language is reflected in different ways, I think, in the different sort of forms of writing in between poetry and prose and so forth. It's in the early part of the 20th century when, during the cultural revival movement and so forth, the urgency of writing as a cultural nationalist more or less sort of drowned everything else out to some extent. That hasn't been the case since a full flowering of serious modernist poetry in the 1940s. But the tensions still remain, and they're there in the background.
Thank you very, very much indeed. I've got 2 more questions I'd love to ask Quillian, but Stephen, is there anything that you'd like to come in with at this point? But thinking about this tension between Gaelic and English, and also in terms of your role outside of Gaelic as a translator, is there a particular quality in that body of work that you're drawn to?
Well, I think one point I'll make, although it's not directly concerned with what you just said, Gareth, but there's a very interesting point that Caoimhin made. Poets beginning to write in the 80s and 90s onwards have tended to be translated, have tended often, well, quite often, to have bilingual books. Some of the great poets who were writing much earlier in the 20th century, I'm thinking of Shota Iatashvili and others, remained untranslated for a long, long time. I mean, Shota Iatashvili now is being quite widely translated, but that's only something that's happened in the past 10 years, let's say, in terms of his poetry being published in English. And that actually is quite a, you can almost map that in many, many places throughout the world. There tend to be some extraordinary fine poets writing, let's say, in the 20s, 30s or 40s, 50s of the 20th century, who remain very little translated because there's a sort of impetus to translate contemporary poetry, which I entirely understand and agree with, but there can be an imbalance. So forgive me for not answering your question or following the important things you were just saying, Gareth, but that's one thing I did want to just mention.
No, Stephen, thank you. I would never attach the word important to what I just said, but Caoimhin, absolutely what you're about to say, I think is. Yes, please.
The one thing that occurred to me, no, I agree totally with what Stephen said, but it's an interesting contrast between, he mentioned Sean O'Riordan, there was Martina Duran, these are the two, and Moira Vakati, the three most prominent poets writing in Irish in the 40s, Moira Vakati in the 50s and 60s. They were, yes, they seem to have, or to some extent, their own poetry community independent of their English language contemporaries, which wasn't the case in Scotland, because Sorla MacLean, of course, belong to, if in the broadest sense, a generation, if we are a little elastic with the years, that did include Hugh McDermott writing in Scots, and Ian Crichton-Smith, who wrote in Scottish Gaelic, and in English, Norman McCaig and other poets. So there was a degree of fluidity and instantaneous translation. The interesting thing to me, thinking of Sorla, I mean, what I read there, which is the translation by Sorla himself of his own poem, and he made many such translations, which is in the book. And there are many of Sorla's poems for which there exists not just his own translations, which tend to be quite raw and seem strange. I mean, there's no attempt to domesticate them into a standardized English. And his translation of his own works are very different from Ian Crichton-Smith's translations. And in some instances, there are both his colleague Ian Crichton-Smith, a great poet in both languages himself, but who tended to be, let's say, slightly more domesticating when he translated Sorla into English than Sorla himself. So there are interesting contrasts between the self-translation of Sorla and his peers' translation of his work from Gaelic into English.
Yeah, good points, well made, absolutely.
Yeah, thank you very much, Caoimhin. I mean, just one more quick question now for you about, the Irish tradition of writing in London. Of course, the diaspora tradition is a very strong and vigorous one. Is there any sense of a kind of enduring Gaelic tradition of poets based in London writing in Gaelic?
Well, no, actually, I may be just a little bit out of touch, to be honest, because if there are, I'm not in touch with them, but Stephen might actually correct me. I know Stephen knows Irish speakers in Hackney, and for all I know, some of them may be poets. That's my ignorance rather than their non-existence.
Well, we'll hope that we can reach them during the course of this project, if not tonight. Thank you so much, Caoimhin. That's really tremendous. And obviously, as they say, please stay on the line, and we'll hopefully come back at the end. That'd be great. Thank you very much indeed. Now, that was really important, I think, for us, Stephen, because, of course, it's, first of all, the proximity culturally and this idea of, an active and constant dialogue with English as part of the process of making. Now, the idea of a diaspora population, as Kristina, of course, is part, and I was asking Caoimhin about there, is really crucial to how a new form of that poetry might emerge, of course, in dialogue with its territorial origins, but absolutely taking on other traditions as it goes and finding new encounters. Now, in terms of your anthology, was there a strong sense of that in some of the locally sourced poets, shall we say, that you drew on, that they were already in a very fertile and new dialogue with perhaps a whole range of languages, not just English here?
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, a poet who we in the end didn't include, but certainly wanted to, Vani Bianconi. His daughter has a translation in the anthology, but and Vani very beautifully gave way to his daughter's translation rather than having a poem of his own. But Vani is a good case in point. He organizes international poetry festivals. He writes about being a Swiss-Italian writer, using the Italian language in Britain. He works quite closely with writers from other traditions and other non-English traditions and languages who are living in London especially. And yes, we did to some extent. I mean, Kristina, who read first, is a good example, a Bulgarian poet living in London, and certainly with dialogues with poets from other traditions. And Noèlia, who we'll read shortly, is a very fine poet herself in Catalan. In fact, she provided a translation of different Catalan poet for the book we put together, but we could have asked her for a poem of her own. London has always, and I mean always, I don't just mean in the past 20 or 30 years, I mean always, has hosted, and I want to use that word as a warm word, because it's become a cold word, poets and writers from many languages over huge long periods of time. And there have been astonishing interactions. There have also been astonishing lapses. You know, I think of my friend Esmail Khoy, the Iranian poet who lived in London from 1982 until his death about a month ago. Great poet, but he was very well known and revered within the Persian-speaking population of London, but very little known outside that, I'm afraid. And I think of a great poet like Sadi Yusuf, the Iraqi poet, who's also lived in London for very many years, and not nearly as well known as he should be in English. Never had a book published in Britain of his own poetry in English. In the United States, yes. But so again, that's veering a little bit away from your question. But we tried to pull together a whole range of voices from many different places, some of whom were living in London, most of whom weren't, but reflecting the languages spoken within Hackney.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Well, I think obviously before we welcome Noèlia, it'd be great to hear your third poem, if we could, your third translation. Thank you.
Well, I'll read a poem from translated from Persian by Ziba Kabasi, who came to London as a young teenager in the 1980s, had to flee Iran with her mother and sisters under threat of their lives, and has lived in London since. And this poem is called Lejki, which is a form of dance. Lejki, that blade thudders grenade pins. Lejki, that shatter stomps grapes into wine, that cuts the deck of earth and explodes love, that fountains the dream into its language, language that tricks out its own dream. And the fall and rise of throat breath, Lejki, on the top and back of the air flares, Lejki, inside clerical weapons and criminal sham, inside chemical weapons and crimson blood, Lejki, go, grow to the heights of breath, heave the devil's tail up its own ass, headbutt your head on death's forehead, rub your shoulders on the cold air, Lejki, pure heart matter pulsing and pumping, stomp a one step forward, two step back dance, sit, dance, sleep, softer than soft soil fallen rain, hailstones and wolverines kneeling into stone, slapping pain on calm's tender balm, Lejki, a girl's eyes on the front line, cobra-ing right, a young guy sleeving away hidden poisons, bitterness on the rim and lining of the cup, there at the round table of bluebirds, Lejki, with listening devices there in all corners, with camera babes sat round their tables, with king and clown and killer, Lejki, your deer and tiger and forest, ever straining one neck higher than before, you leap on saber and broken glass, Sufi of all dancers, my young Sufi. There at the height of the minaret, the swung censer of the high altar, circling spun dancer between sun and time, and poem breath from Shams azure roots. Lejki, from life to death, dance, Lejki, dance. Live and don't die, Lejki, Lejki, don't ever die. And that extraordinary power in her poem saying, don't ever die, given what her family and her friends had been through. And she brought that to London. She brought that extraordinary energy of language to London, which is something, you know, important to say. One of the wonderful things about putting together this anthology was bringing together the wonderful breadths of such rich and varied poetry and saying this is what poetry can be.
It really can be. Thank you so much, Stephen. And of course, your wonderful translation of that, conveying it to us who don't have the Persian. I'd like to draw attention now, of course, to the book itself. It seems a good time to do that. If one looks at the distinctive layout, of course, of each of the languages, one sees the left and right tablature, depending on the language. And this beautiful design, of course, is thanks to Joe Hales. There we are. That's the book, obviously in reverse for you, but hopefully all of you will have it, or if not, we'll have it very shortly. Wonderful design by Joe Hales. Many thanks to Joe for putting this together. Of course, a great designer across the board in all sorts of other areas as well. And it's the fact that it's a very portable book. It's a light touch book with great content, of course, and very easy to navigate. It's really important, I think, to maximizing the audience, of course, for this great collection. Now, Stephen, the idea of language as an activating agent for new forms of connection, new forms of relationship, you know, is clearly central to this book. Now, you have obviously worked with Ziba and also with Golan, you know, over a long period of time, and of course in collections in some cases. But how do you find your way into a single poem? Let's say you're perhaps commissioned to translate a poem or to realize an English version, and you don't have that connection necessarily. You don't necessarily know, you know, your way through the larger body of that poet's work. Is there a way in that you found that is useful, or does it change with every single translation?
I think it changes with every single translation, and every single translator would give a different answer to you know, the answer I might give. I tend to try to avoid single commissions because for me, I feel I need to know a poet's work. I need to know the poet. So the way into a poet's work is, where possible, and this is sometimes a luxury, it is not possible, but where possible, by knowing the poet. I mean, with Ziba Kabasi, for instance, she heard me reading my poetry about 20 years ago, and she approached me and said, she felt some similarity in our languages, even though Persian and English are very, very different, but some sort of similarity in a sort of Ura language. I do feel that very strongly, that there is an Ura language of poetry underlying certain poetries. So she approached me, and then we began seeing if we could work together. With Golan Haji, I met him at a festival in Syria in 2010. The year before everything exploded in that country. It was a wonderful festival. It lasted 12 days. So there was the chance, the opportunity to get to know people. I talked a lot to Golan. We started translating each other's poetry. And then when he came to Paris, I was able to go and visit Paris and stay in his house with his family and work intensively with him. So there's that sort of intensity of friendship and knowing, access to something because you are with someone wherever possible. For me, that's what matters. And I think other translators will work wonderfully to single poem commissions, but it's not something that occasionally it happens and it can lead to other things for me, but it's something I tend not to follow personally.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Well, I think matched only by my inability to obviously arrive on time for an event that I'm moderating is my inability to navigate the Zoom Q&A participant chat relationship, because Martin has had a question well placed in the Q&A, very easily discoverable by anyone who's vaguely conscious, about the poets and our other guests defining their relationship to English language poetry being written in Britain today. Now, Martin, I've obviously singularly failed to ask that question on your behalf to two of our guests. I will absolutely bring it forward in the next two guests' conversations, but perhaps we have by default touched on it in other parts of our responses. I do hope so. And as Rosa has posted in the panelists and attendees option in chat, which of course I had not identified when I suggested that Kristina might want to post things, anybody can post in various configurations within the chat any links they would like to share. And we will send a full list of credits for the readings at the end, as Rosa has suggested. Now, Chris in the Q&A, just before we welcome Noèlia, has asked me to mention the Mother Tongues book. Now this, I'm afraid, again, showing my third degree of failure this evening. And it's only just past 7 o'clock. Who knows what else is going to come in the rest of the evening. I do not know what the Mother Tongues book is, and I wish I did, but maybe Stephen, you do.
Mother Tongues was an anthology of poetry published, I think, in 2001 as a special edition of the journal Modern Poetry and Translation, which brought together about 50 poets writing mostly in London, writing in languages other than English, and it did have quite a worldwide range, from poets from Chile living in Britain, poets from Hungary, poets from Poland, poets from Iran, poets from China. So it was maybe one of the first attempts 20 years ago to take some measure of the fact that many wonderful poets writing in languages other than English were and still are living in Britain and living in London.
Thank you very much indeed, and very good to have you here, Stephen, for that simple reason, if not for all the other magnificent reasons. Now, Noèlia, you've been waiting so patiently. It's a real pleasure to welcome you now.
Hello.
Noèlia, yep, we can see you and hear you. Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being so patient, and thank you so much for being with us, and also for doing the very good deed of translating another poet for this publication, which is very, very generous of you. So I'm going to just disappear now briefly, and you're, I think, going to read two poems for us in both Catalan and English. Is that right?
Yes. Well, hello, everyone. Well, thank you, Gareth, for having me. And I'll be reading two poems that are included in the book and one poem from my own collection. And the two poems that are included in the book are written by, that are translated, are written by Maria Mercè Marçal. And these are from her posthumous book, The Body's Reason, that I had the honor to translate with Montserrat Abelló, another Catalan poet. And Montserrat Abelló was a political exile from Franco's dictatorship, and she went into exile to Chile. And the first poem is Pèrdua. Com la florida entre la neu, sobtada, la sang l'ataca, el senyal de la pèrdua desmentint la mort. Loves. Like flowers in the snow, suddenly the blot, the stain, testifying the loss, denying death. The second poem is entitled Resurrectio. Ma genollo davant el cos impur, obscè, mortal, primer país, vivent, taüt, obert, d'on vinc no hi ha, mare, una altra naixença. Resurrectio. I kneel down before the body, impure, obscene, mortal, primal country, alive, open coffin, whence I come. There is not, mother, another birth. And the third poem is from my collection, Bloody Roots, Arrels Sagnants, which is bilingual too, and published by Francis Bootle Publishers. The poem is entitled Exitu and has an epigraph by Maria Mercè Marçal, who is a very great influence in my poetry. Exitu. Jo ric amorg del rèptil extermini, Maria Mercè Marçal. Riu i balla el cranc amb l'escorpit, enceten la dansa del gessamí. Però la cua de serp a la beuratge d'esclou, l'antic secret, existència de mi i sense mi, i conjura la vella cançó de poetes i d'àvies. Els peus vençuts em fan d'hostatge. Exitu. I smile with the pride of the exterminating reptile. Maria Mercè Marçal. They laugh and dance, the crab and the scorpion, and begin the dance of jasmine. A drink of the tail of the snake uncovers an ancient secret, living with me or without me, and we recall the old songs of poets and grandmothers. Disappointed feet make me their hostage. Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Noèlia. Wonderful readings. Thank you for sharing your poem with us as well. That's great to hear. Now, in a little bit of a similar manner to the conversation with Caoimhin, there's obviously that tension for you between Catalan and Spanish, which can obviously take a very particular political turn at certain points. But in linguistic terms, again, it can be seen, you know, in a population sense as an uneven struggle. But I just wonder if you could give us a sense of how that, I mean, very briefly, of course, how that literary relationship has kind of ebbed and flowed in relation to poetry over recent years. Is there a pattern to that kind of dynamic?
Well, as you said, inevitably, and regarding, you know, the historical events, just by using Catalan, it's in itself a political statement. But apart from that, I do not, you know, I don't like saying that, but I do not do politics with the poetry. I'm very much interested in filling the void that I feel between my own experiences as a bilingual person, although I do not believe that I do not believe in bilingual identities. There is always a relationship with power there, with the language. But I'm more interested in poetry, like for my point of view, in filling this void, this gap between my own experiences as a woman and language. So between my current personal experiences and the dialogue I have with tradition, with Western tradition, that includes, you know, Catalan tradition that intends to go back to the beginning of the Catalan poetic tradition that starts with the troubadours there. But for me, Catalan has always been, like, let's say, the language of love, because it's the language of my family and where I live. And I discovered the poetic and literary tradition in Catalan later on. So my education was in Castilian.
Thank you very, very much.
Very briefly.
No, thank you. I mean, it's obviously a huge question and very well answered. Thank you. Now, I've become aware in just in the last couple of months of a new London. Sorry, I've just muted myself there. I've become aware in the last couple of months of a new London-based Catalan press, I think primarily prose at the moment, called Fum d'Estampa.
Full Estampa. Yes.
Is that right? Yep. So they're completely wrong on my part, but you know what I mean, which is great. So people can find that, and that obviously suggests, you know, a certain confidence, of course, here that there is a new or possible reception to Catalan writers in the UK. What is your sense of the current strength of Catalan writing? You know, first of all, of course, in Catalan, are we in a good moment for Catalan writing, poetry and prose? And are you confident about its kind of ability now to move into a wider audience, as it clearly is with this press?
In the Iberian Peninsula, I mean, within the so-called Catalan countries, which these are the Catalan-speaking areas in the Iberian Peninsula and also Sardinia and Southeast Perpignan, which is called the Catalonia North. I'm very positive with the current situation. The Catalan language has a long and very established tradition in poetry, and also with prose, but Catalan language and culture is precisely strong with poetry. And again, I have to mention the troubadours. Going back to the presence of poetry is quite strong at the moment.
Thank you very much. And you're obviously an important and dynamic part of that. Now, what is your sense of Catalan diaspora populations and their writing activity outside of the Catalan, territories that you've just described? Are there key areas, key cities where we should be looking out for some of this newer hybrid work that I mentioned earlier in terms of Catalan moving into other territories?
Yes, I think that we can look at, for example, Edinburgh and Scotland, where the presence of the Catalan language and culture is very strong in there. We can also look at the presence of Catalan poetry and prose in London, of course, because as just Stephen said, London hosts, in a very warm way, a very tremendous variety of languages and cultures. But again, so to say that I think that Castilian takes a little bit over the other languages that are spoken in Spain, such as Galician or Basque or Catalan.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm very pleased that you mentioned Scotland, because certainly from our point of view here, much of the conversation around the Spanish-Catalan relationship, of course, has been also compared to the English-Scottish relationship, and it seems to make complete sense that Scotland and Catalonia, make cultural and perhaps other associations as well. Now, thank you. Yeah. Now, Stephen, I just in your sense of Noèlia's work, of course, Maria's work, and the sense of Catalan as a tradition that goes all the way back, but really has a sense of relevance and vibrancy now. Are you energized by the larger sense of possibility that Catalan literature offers in relation to Castilian Spanish, let's say, as much as anything else?
Yeah, it seems from my perspective that quite a lot of Catalan poets have been translated, and increasingly so, and there's a real vibrancy and energy about, and complexity as well, about a lot of that. I think there's a lot of support from founding bodies within Catalonia and the Catalan-speaking areas to support translations, and there's a wonderful vibrancy. And just as an aside, incidentally, one of the books, one of the Catalan poets translated for the new press you mentioned, Gareth, from Des Dampa, is Christopher White, who himself is a Scottish Gaelic poet. So yes, that is also a very nice but very natural overlap. So a Scottish Gaelic poet translating a contemporary Catalan poet into English.
Yeah, Christopher was one of the first translators of Catalan poetry into English.
Yeah.
That's very nice. Thank you so much, Noèlia. Time moves on, I'm afraid, but it's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Do stay with us just for the next few minutes, and thank you very much indeed for your contributions. That's really great. Now, Steve, thank you. Now, Stephen, I'm aware time is moving on, and I do feel that we must welcome young Lian.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lian, please do join us if you could. Are you there, Lian? Yeah, could you?
Is that okay?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for your patience, Lian. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now,
no problem. We have China has a long history, so I'm fine.
Absolutely, that's a very good way of putting it, and I might use that when I'm late again, actually, even though I have no Chinese participants in the event I might be doing. I'll still use it. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Now, I remember a very powerful reading that you gave in the estuary, the Thames estuary in Essex, as part of the literature festival there a few years ago, in which your poetry literally took the roof off the tent in which we were assembled. And Stephen was your translating reader there. Very, very powerful reading that gave us a sense of the power of poetry. Now, you have had many, many years in London, and you've brought a very distinctive bringing together of Chinese poetry, your own extraordinary work, and also, of course, you know, this dialogue with English and its sense of place. Now, I wonder if you could share your poem, of course, read in Chinese, and then Stephen will, I believe, take up the translation, if that's right.
Yes, let's do our traditional way, which is I read the poem which titled 1989, and then Stephen read the English translation. Well, I will talk a little bit maybe about poems this poem later. 1989年，谁说死者会互相拥抱？像一匹匹马，鬃毛银灰，站在窗外结冰的月光中。死者埋进过去的日子，刚刚过去，疯子就被绑在床上，僵直如铁钉，钉着黑暗的木头。棺盖每天就这样合拢。谁说死者已死去？死者关在末日里流浪，是永久的主人。4堵墙上有4张自己的脸，再屠杀一次，血仍是唯一著名的风景。睡进坟墓有福了，却又醒在一个鸟儿更怕的明天。这无非是普普通通的一年。Stephen, please.
Thank you, Lian. This translation is by Brian Hoxton, and yes. Great translator, Scottish translator also. And I thank Brian for letting me use his voice. 1989. Who says the dead can embrace? Like fine horses, manes silver grey, standing outside the window in the freezing moonlight, the dead are buried in the days of the past. In days not long past, madmen were tied onto beds, rigid as iron nails, pinning down the timbers of darkness, the coffin lid each day closing over like this. Who says the dead are dead and gone? The dead enclosed in the vagrancy of their final days are the masters of forever. 4 faces of their own on 4 walls. Butchery yet again. Blood is still the only famous landscape. Slept into the tomb. They were lucky, but they wake again in a tomorrow the birds fear even more. This is no doubt a perfectly ordinary year.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, Lian.
Thank you both very much. Now, Lian, I think you might be reading another one for us shortly. Is that right? You'll have another poem ready.
Well, if I will have to read only 5 minutes, I think this is what we want to read, because
yeah, I think maybe
otherwise it will be a bit too long. Another part.
Well, perhaps we could close with your poem in the collection. Would that work to close in a minute? Not quite yet, but could that work for you both?
In that case, may I just invite Stephen to read the English translation only for this poem, which included by the anthology. Is that okay?
Should we do that, Stephen? But should we just hold that? Should we just hold that a little bit and let's just speak with you, Lian, a little bit first, because
Absolutely.
We must.
No, we must do. I mean, I'm really interested in your time in London. You now live in Berlin, but when you were in London for many years, you did bring together this sense of your own literary tradition, a very distinctive one in your case, with, you know, one of your most well-known collections here, of course, the Lee Valley poems. What was your sense of being, there we are, thank you very much. You can buy the Lee Valley poems, of course, at all good independent bookshops, along with Lian's other work, and of course, much more work besides that we've been talking about. Now, the Lee Valley, of course, a very distinctive London, East London landscape, and you lived near that. And what was your sense of being in London for those years, and how it affected and changed your poetry?
You know, when my wife and I moved to London in end of 1996, after about nearly 9 years since we traveling and exiled around the world again and again, and then after this moving, let's say, endlessly experience, and then we said, okay, why don't we now is a time to change the way of living, maybe also change the way of writing. And so that time we spoke a very poor English, but is better than nothing. Then we choose, okay, let's try London. And then actually to find our apartment in Stoke Newington, where near Lee Valley, was simply by chance. We had no idea at all about the area, but we were feeling good about the apartment inside. But only, let's say, take 3 or 4 years, and gradually, well, I feel that I regained another local, you know, because this word for me, it was so important as a Chinese. It was linked directly with, let's say, our homeland, our hometown, our home area. But how could I gain a local, you know, in the certainly strange country and totally, let's say, the foreign country, nothing to do with my growth. But because of this, let's say, the strange feeling, well, then gradually I understand that the local, in another word, the root of myself and my poetry is not been given by others only. It's actually archetypally grown by ourselves into the soil, and therefore into the language, and therefore into the experience, life experience, you know, bring all this together into an idea of book, which is the Lee Valley poems. And in this book, I try to write the images as local as possible. But the more local of the images are, and the more international experience has been expressed. So yeah, in that case, well, I have to say it's not only London identity or England identity, it is Lee Valley identity.
That's tremendous. I mean, it's really great to hear, you know, that you are so local, as you say, in such an active sense of the word, while bringing this extraordinary body of life experience to that date, to this place. And as you say, it's about the Lee Valley, and out of that comes the new world of your making. Now, that was obviously a very significant moment for you, and in terms of your writing and how it might find its way. Did that that relationship continue for you then? I mean, now you're in Germany, of course, and you know that might take its own time to find a space. But did it fundamentally change how you think about your writing?
Let's say it's proved what I let's say believe and thought before. Well, to sum up that experience into one sentence, I would like to say the international within the local, because we are all, let's say, very international, and now the globalization bring everybody becoming international. But is there any meaning of international if we don't have the depth of the local? Another way, if we cannot making a good exchanges between the depth of different locals, and is there any meaning of international? So because of this, then I have to say that the Lee Valley gave a very, very interesting, let's say, and positive proof of this idea, which we have to discover the depth of local in order to let's say, to understand what's mean of this international experience. So because of this experience, I must say that certainly it's opened the door of understanding about even my own writing in China. It's not just because I was in China, therefore I actually have so-called my identity. No, it's not that simple. And it's everything has to based on how much you can discover the depth of your own, let's say, life, language, cultural tradition, and to bring that into an creative, version. And so this is again, like I learned this from my international experience, and also come back to the Chinese tradition, and then pushing the creative changes much more, let's say, actively.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Now, I mean, you have obviously won many international prizes, and we are very aware now, of course, of Chinese literature and culture more generally as we move into what has been called the Chinese century. We're massively aware of the changing nature of the world and where economic and political shifts are happening. Are you confident at the moment that alongside those political and economic changes, that Chinese culture in the broader sense, particularly contemporary writing, is also traveling alongside those changes to us? Do you feel confident about Chinese literature reaching us at this point?
Well, I must say that within the international, let's say, literature or the literature of war, the Chinese is still a huge but minority, a very small minority, and not so many people know, for example, contemporary Chinese poetry. And partly, well, that was why I chose this 1989, and it was clearly linked with Tiananmen massacre, happened in the 4th of June, 1989. And the poem was directly written after the Tiananmen massacre. And there was important about the last line, which Stephen read, that this is a perfectly ordinary, year, which shocked all my friends and say, how could you think this Tiananmen, this year is the ordinary year? But I wanted to say that, well, if we are so surprised about this killing, and how about our all memories about the death happened before, but if we don't have any memory about all this, the tragedies in the past, and how could we guarantee this killing and the shocking will be again just prepare for the next forgetting? And so the Chinese case, I think, after all, it's nothing to do with only the size, like a huge size of economy and huge size of noise or something. The Chinese case is focused at one word of depth. And I think the depth of the cultural transformation, the depth of the reality based on the history, and the depth, after all, is of the individual awareness about this, all this, whatever the troubles or the questions, especially the questions, because all those questions about the life, about the culture, about our own language is coming back, becoming the creative energy of writing. And so in this case, I really do not care how commercial. China is extremely commercial, but I care whether there are people, or how the quality of people are touching this kind of depth and quality. So this is also a very interesting case, because China is hugely commercial today, but at the same time, strangely enough, there are never been so many people write poetry, and the quantity was unbelievably huge. Even so, of course, the quality is a so small percentage of this whole thing, but compared with the past, this is never happened before. So I don't want to say I'm a positive or negative. I think I will continually, let's say, maybe be exiled from China, but never be exiled from the Chinese language, and continually pushing this kind of a change.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's great to put language and writing at the center of this conversation, and I'm really glad that you did that there, Lian. Thank you so much. I'm really aware of the time. We could have wonderful conversations with you and all our wonderful guests that go on far longer than we have time for now, but I am aware of the time, and I would love if we could, if you're happy, Lian, that Stephen reads your poem.
I'm very happy this, yeah.
From the collection.
Yeah, this is part of the sequence called the What Water Confirmed. And so that is directly linked with the Hackney, which is nice, but also bring Hackney and China together. So I'm very happy Stephen will show this, the translation, which made by Brian Houghton again. Thank you so much. Very nice. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
I'll read that now, though I'm sad that Lian won't read the Chinese, but wonderful, that local and international. Part 4, What Water Confirms. In Hackney, the river is a hidden god, only seen when the autumn floods rise. Under the streets, glaciers keep grinding in the rebated trench. A woodblock, waterways, clouds, annotated 1, bows to the meeting of wandering. This day uniquely only once exists. Soaked with light, pierced again and again by the fluttering of a water bird. Georgia, Victoria, Edward, Elizabeth. What if it was the kingdom of Wei or the Tang dynasty? The brass fireplace where the ashes of the dead drift. A pair of ivory white eyeballs gaze after his footsteps. A string of small parts names spread like ripples, rings of green by the mouth. A chapel, a bell always desperately ringing at the prow, imitating the one on the Whampoa in heavy fog. Landforms hold a foundling tight. Wrecked cars abandoned at the roadside. Distance is dug away like a motor. What if one line of Chinese poetry lets the rain empty a room even more? Water dives back to the ancient hearing of the marshes. Water probably weary of flowing too. Missed it. Tired too. A red brick wall is like a line running parallel to time. Night after night extends. Then there's the lonely structure of an individual. Let him guess that's what he wants. Rudder dries up and cracks in the wind. Pearly light thrashes in the sleeping oyster. Hackney is like a short Chinese verse. Treasuring the moonlight, she fears leaves of a calendar turned over. A little plaza with a local accent holds dirty pigeons to its bosom and breaks into pieces.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Wonderful.
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you, Lian, for writing it. Wonderful poem and a wonderful way, I think, to close this event, bringing international language into the heart of Hackney, of course, the borough in which Peer is held and in which this whole undertaking has taken place. Please, obviously, do continue to support Peer. and all the writers. Follow them in all the ways you know how. You'll find them online, both our writers, our translators. I'm going now just to close our brief conversation with Lian to post in the chat details of his anthology of contemporary Chinese poetry with W.N. Herbert, published by Blood Axe, as he is, of course, also with a number of his collections. So please do make this conversation one that's ongoing. The book is a springboard. It's both an arrival and a departure point for much greater discovery of all the writers and all the languages involved, of course, and it can transfer internationally. One can make a version of that, of course, for oneself wherever one lives and finds oneself. Thank you so much to everyone involved. Of course, Kristina, Caoimhin, Noèlia, Lian and Stephen, to Isabel, Rosa and Ingrid, to everyone else at Peer and all the supporting and funding agencies that have made this possible. There are many publications devoted to literature and translation, many small and larger presses. You will find those if you would like to in all the ways that you know how to search. But thank you very much indeed for attending, and do please, of course, find your way to Peer Gallery if you're in London, and to Shoreditch Library. This is also a project indivisibly connected to libraries where books are held for public use for all without any hindrance or exclusion. That's what a library is for. That's what this collection is for. Please do find and support everything that you value in this regard, wherever you find yourself. And thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for driving this forward from conception to where we are now. I'd like to just ask you, Stephen, if you could, to sow the seed forward. Hannah Schuckbach, the wonderful Swiss artist, filmmaker, and great advocate, is developing a major show for you in London, which is already manifested in Switzerland. I just wonder if you could leave us with a thought about that, because that celebrates your 40 years of work in supporting literature and translation.
Yeah, that's really nice of you to mention that there was an exhibition in Zurich this past fortnight that I couldn't travel to because of quarantine restrictions, and that exhibition will come to London and will also, as the Peer exhibition has done, and I'm very grateful to Peer for asking me to involve my bibliography in their superb exhibition. But yeah, Hannah's show will be at the Nunnery Gallery at the beginning of next year.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Nunnery, Peer, wonderful public galleries, really working in a direct and engaged way with the community and with the culture of the community. Thank you, Ingrid, for making that possible. In my Zoom frame, you are in the center of the picture, exactly as you should be. And so I'm now going to step back. And if you have any words you'd like to close the evening with, thank you very much indeed for starting the evening and covering for me. Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you, Gareth. And thank you, Stephen, and thank you everybody for coming along, and those people who participated. And this is recorded in all of the events that we're doing over between now and the end of the project, and on the 14th of August will be available in some way online. And if you missed the wonderful celebration on the 5th of June, I think Rosa put that the link to that in the chat earlier. So anyway, thank you everybody for coming along, and see you soon.